Hello, good morning guys. Bali off topic tayo ngayon. Ano muna sa news. Gusto ko lang to yung tawag dito, yung Nestle. Very informative kasi ito eh. Nung napanood ko na to matagal na eh, pero nagandahan kasi ako sa ano na to, yung sa history niya. Kung paano na ano yung Nestle. Meron ditong may crime kasi nga 'di ba yung great fortune kasi yung Nestle ngayon napakayaman na kumpanya eh. May kasabihan nga yung pag napakayaman na yung tawag dito yung great fortune lies great crimes. Yung parang ganon. Naano ko yun, naalala ko yun eh. Kaya panoorin natin yung kung paano nagsimula yung Nestle, paano siya lumaki ng ganito at yung sinasabi nilang crime na nagawa niya para siya lumaki ganito. Okay? Panoorin natin. Nestle, pasok.
In the world's poorest countries, around 1 in 4 children are engaged in child labour.
The world's biggest food company, Nestlé.
A Nestle company.
Nestle
collects millions of gallons a year from springs in Southern California.
Would you agree with me that your product should not be used where there is impure water?
They are taking the water that should not be owned by anybody.
Using indentured servants in parts of Asia, of using child slave labor in parts of Africa. They've been trying to steal water everywhere from Brazil to Flint, Michigan. When it comes to corporations operating without any regard to human health and safety, the Nestle Corporation really seems to be in a league all of its own. What's going on with this company?
Nestlé is the largest food and beverage corporation in the entire world. They own over 2,000 different brands and sell chocolate, cereal, coffee, baby food, water, ice cream, and
Ayun, ang dami nilang produkto, 'di ba? Halos 2,000. Alas nang nung nabuhay ka, nung baby ka, yung gatas nila, pagtanda mo, yung kape, yung lahat, halos lahat ng mula pagkasilang hanggang kamatayan, gumagamit tayo ng Nestle product. Kaya magandang topic 'to eh, very informative.
So much more. In fact, it would be difficult to go shopping and not buy something that's owned by Nestlé. And yet, the company is accused of some truly horrific things, including child slavery, killing babies, exploiting the poor, claiming water shouldn't be a human right, and countless other scandals. So, what's the truth? And if Nestlé really is this evil, how are they getting away with it? This video is a journey into the dark world of Nestlé, a look behind the curtain at one of the most controversial companies ever. But to understand the story of Nestlé, we first need to go back to the man who started it all.
Yung intro na ginawa ni Magnate Media talaga sa horror, parang horror film. Courtesy pala to ni Magnates Media. Bali kung magaganda yung mga topic niya eh. Bali subscribe nyo, tsaka lagi nyo i-like yung niya. Very informative.
The story of Nestlé begins with the birth of a boy in Frankfurt in 1814. Henry Nestlé was the 11th of 14 children and was born into a family of glaziers, where the trade of cutting and fitting glass had been passed down from father to son for many generations. However, as Henry got older, he became fascinated with chemistry and decided he wanted to become a pharmacist instead of going into the family trade, which caused a bit of a rift.
Ayun, yung yung pamilya pala nila yung sa yung linya ng sa salamin, yung mga glaciers. Bali siya dun eh, parang wala siyang hindi niya porte yung ganon. Kaya mas naano siya sa chemistry. Yun nga, sa chemistry. Kaya nagkaroon sila ng ano ng father niya, yung hidwaan. Kasi syempre pagka ano ka, gusto mo sundan yung yapak mo eh. Pero ayaw niya. Kaya yun, nag-ibang landas yan.
Between him and his dad's. But Henry was determined to follow his own path, and at 15, he began working as a pharmacist's apprentice before later leaving his hometown in Germany to go and live in Switzerland.
Ayun no. Ang galing ng ano na to kasi yung story niya, tignan mo, umalis siya para ipaano yung ano niya. Nagpunta from Frankfurt, Germany to Switzerland. Kasi may dream talaga siya eh. Kaya ayun, sige, ituloy natin.
Where he worked on concocting medicines and chemical experiments. It was here in Switzerland that Henry would start one of the biggest corporations in the world. In fact, to this day, Vevey in Switzerland remains the headquarters of Nestlé. But it wasn't until much later in his life that Henry started Nestlé. Before his big break, Henry tried all kinds of different entrepreneurial ideas. Like he started producing and selling liqueurs, vinegars, rum, lemonade, and even fertilizers. But none of his business ideas ever seemed to take off. It wasn't until Henry was in his 50s that he finally had his big breakthrough.
Ayun no. Marami siyang sinubukan ng negosyo. Negosyante talaga siya, entrepreneur. Kaya ano talaga eh. Kaya tignan mo, 50 na siya na ano. Kaya yung mga batang negosyante diyan. Ayun nga. Sige lang. Pagpatuloy nyo lang yung mga ano nyo, yung tawag dito, yung craft nyo. Kung negosyante kayo or ano. Kasi siya nga 50 years old na siya bago niya na ni Nestlé. Sabihin, matanda na siya. Pero talaga, si ganun yung negosyante, talagang ano, yung anin lahat ng opportunity. Kung pumaksak man, hindi sumusuko. Perseverance, may perseverance.
It all began when Henry read a report that infant mortality had become extremely high because many women couldn't breastfeed their children or their children were allergic to the milk. Henry realized this massive problem was also a big opportunity. There was clearly a major need for an artificial alternative to breastfeeding that could save countless babies' lives. And thus, Henry began to study all the existing information about breast milk and conduct a series of experiments in his lab with various different ingredients. But saving children's lives wasn't the only thing that pushed Henry day and night to find a breast milk substitute. His own tragedy also played a part, as Henry's wife had many health issues of her own, and thus was unable to give birth. So as a way to channel her maternal instincts, she became extremely concerned about other people's babies, and pushed Henry to create a breast milk substitute that could save lives. And by 1867, he'd succeeded. Henry had created one of the first ever baby formulas, essentially a formulated mixture of cow's milk, flour, and sugar, which could...
Ayun, ang first ano pala ng ano Nestlé product ay ano, yung breastfeeding, breast milk. Ayun, yun yung una nilang ano, yung produkto. Doon sila nagsimula. Yung unang na-invento nila yung may cow's milk, flour tsaka sugar. Yan yung unang substitute to breast milk.
Be a substitute to natural breast milk. Henry then created a company called Nestlé to begin selling it. And so you see, Nestlé began with such great intentions. A humble guy creating a life-saving product for babies who couldn't breastfeed naturally. Unfortunately, this isn't a heartwarming success story. If anything, this is a horror movie. You see, whilst baby food was the
Ayun nga, si Henry Nestlé, talaga yung good intention ng ano niya. Na kasi nung panahon na yon, maraming ang namamatay na mga bata, mga bago silang nasanggol kasi nga yung syempre dati hindi pa yung tawag doon, yung cleanliness sa mga produkto, kaya yung mga mortality ng mga bata mataas, mga newborn child. Kaya ayun, naisip niya substitute to breast milk nga, yung bottle milk yung tawag nila.
product that started Nestlé's dominance, it was also the product that would later destroy lives and create an international scandal. And as Nestlé grew into a giant conglomerate, they became shrouded in all kinds of dark controversies. But we'll get to that. At first, Henry's new baby formula was a big success. Orders were coming in so quickly that Henry had to open up a factory to keep up with the demand. He couldn't believe it. Everything was happening so fast and money was pouring in. With the huge success of this first product, Henry then partnered with a Swiss chocolatier to create another new product. And in 1875, they created the first chocolate milk. In the space of just a couple of years, Henry went from being a small, unknown pharmacist in Switzerland to one of the richest men in the country, and Nestlé was growing more and more every month. But in a way, it was all a bit too much for Henry, who was entering.
Ang galing niya, no? From small pharmacist hanggang sa most richest, siya naging pinakamayaman sa sa Switzerland. Ang galing.
The final stages of his life and wanted to relax and spend more time with his wife. And so, a few years later, Henry decided to retire and sell his company. And this is where things get really interesting. You see, the new owners who took over Nestlé had big plans to expand the company, and in 1905 they merged with a rival business who sold similar products called Anglo-Swiss, and together they became known as the Nestlé Group. By pooling all their resources together instead of competing, it allowed them to more easily dominate the market and expand their product lines. By the
Ayun, pinagbenta pala ni kasi ni Henry Nestlé yung niya, yung tawag doon, yung company niya. Kasi nga yung asawa niya parang niya yung wala ng time. Nagrereklamo sa kanya kasi wala ng time, kasi matatanda na sila. Kaya yung binenta niya. Doon nagsimula yung kasi yung napagbentahan niya yung ayun nga gustong yung produkto nila gusto mapalaki, kaya ayun siya, panoorin natin ulit.
1920s, Nestlé was creating new chocolates and different beverages, and by 1938, they'd created the first mass-market coffee. Their timing was great, as instant coffee helped keep soldiers awake during the Second World War, and thus it became included in all emergency rations of every US soldier. As well as creating new products, the Nestlé Group quite often just acquired other companies they saw potential in, or that they thought could be serious competition. And so, as the years went by, Nestlé's list of products grew and grew, and so did their wealth and power. Unfortunately, that wasn't enough for them, and behind the scenes, a plan was being hatched. A plan that would make millions of dollars, but risk millions of lives.
Skip. Chapter 2, The Babykiller.
When Henry Nestlé first created his baby formula back in 1867, the whole idea was a supplement to help mothers who couldn't breastfeed their children, certainly not to try and replace breast milk altogether. And the reason for that is studies have shown that natural breast milk is healthier than any formula. Natural breast milk is widely recommended by the World Health Organization, American Medical Association, UNICEF, and countless others. So for a while, baby formula was sold simply as an alternative for those who needed it. But in the 1970s, roughly 100 years after the company first began, sales seemed to be slowing down, and Nestlé started to get greedy. They wondered, what if we could sell this baby formula to all mothers, not just those who actually need it? You see, despite all the other products Nestlé had launched, baby formula was still one of Nestlé's biggest moneymakers, and that's because it has very high profit margins. So imagine how much more money they could make if they could expand their market to all mothers. So Nestlé began a campaign.
Ayun, nag-ano pala sila ng yung kahit yung mga nagpapa-breastfeed ng ng baby, inano nila na na lahat na basta may anak ka, yun ang campaign nila na lahat ay required ng yung bottle milk. Panoorin natin kasi pagkakasabwati nila ito yung mga ano eh, yung mga doktor, mga nurses, mga big pharmacies. Ayun, kakasabwati nila.
To undermine breast milk and aggressively advertise their baby formula as being superior, manipulating mothers into believing Nestlé's formula was a necessity for the health of their babies and that it would be better for their child than breastfeeding, when in reality, the evidence was the opposite. Nestlé's formula was vastly inferior to natural milk, as it lacked many of the nutrients that helped babies fight off disease and keep them healthy. By encouraging mothers to switch when they didn't need to, it was putting their babies at a higher risk of infection and malnutrition. In order to make sure mothers believed this information though, Nestlé began paying off doctors and hospitals to peddle their formula.
Ayun, nagbayad sila ng doktor tsaka mga hospital para i-promote yung bottle milk.
By asking them to tell mothers it was better than breastfeeding. Nestlé then ramped this up further in Africa and Asia, where they would hire saleswomen to dress up like nurses and convince mothers to give up breastfeeding and use their formula instead.
Ayun. Talaga may greed yun eh. May greed na yung kapag talaga yung tao na sa greed, wala kasi lang kabusugan kahit nasa iyo na lahat ng kayamanan. Madaling yung pag-greed ang nag sa'yo, hindi ka makakontento.
These saleswomen were paid on commission, meaning the more formula they sold, the more money they made, thus encouraging them to sell the formula very aggressively, which they did. These saleswomen, posing as genuine nurses, would walk the halls of maternity wards, or even visit mothers at their homes unannounced and sell them on Nestlé's baby formula. And it gets much worse. Nestlé got these fake nurses to hand out free samples of their formula.
Ayun, nagano pa sila ng fake nurses para ng product nila. Diba
To mothers. Except they gave them just enough samples that by the time the samples ran out, the mothers would have stopped producing milk naturally and thus had no choice but to pay for Nestlé's expensive product to keep their child alive. This proved to be very successful and profitable for Nestlé, and so they expanded this plan to many other locations, but especially developing nations, where many of the women weren't educated enough to know the information they were being fed.
Ayun, inaano nila yung mga uneducated. Sila sa mga yung sa mga developing countries. Kasi syempre yung developing countries hindi pa yun yung hindi pa yung mga well educated yung mga tao doon, kaya madali maniwala. Kaya yung mayayaman talaga nila yung motto ng mga great company, keep them ignorant, keep them poor and ignorant, so they can they can manipulate, they can exploit them.
Wasn't true. After all, if a woman who appears to be a qualified nurse is telling you that your baby needs this product, you're just gonna believe them. Of course, the consequences were fatal. It's estimated millions of babies died or were made severely deficient in essential nutrients because of this. The worst impact was in third world countries where there was no access to clean water. The big problem was that the baby formula had to be mixed with water, and yet Nestlé was convincing people they needed to use this baby formula in places where clean water was in very short supply. So the formula was getting mixed with water that was polluted and contaminated, thus making the babies ill. To make matters even worse, because many of these women couldn't afford to keep buying the baby formula that their babies now depended on, they instead diluted it with even more water, which meant that the babies didn't get enough of the nutrients they needed from the formula, leading to malnutrition. It didn't help that the instructions on the packaging were in English, which most of the mothers in these countries couldn't read. So they didn't even realize that by diluting it so much, they were starving their children. This also meant many of them didn't know they needed to boil the water first to prevent bacteria making their babies sick. For a while, Nestlé did nothing about any of this, and seemed to be getting away with it all. But then in 1974, a publication entitled The Babykiller specifically called out the serious consequences of aggressively pushing baby formula in these countries. Nestlé was listed for its involvement in creating a need that didn't exist before, then convincing consumers the product was necessary, and then getting them hooked on it, all whilst completely ignoring the tragic consequences. When this was translated into German by Swiss campaigners, it was given the very blunt title, Nestlé Kills Babies, which led to Nestlé taking legal action against them. But it was all too late. All this coverage created an international scandal for Nestlé, and boycotts were launched against them in numerous countries. Despite this, the company remained quiet on the issue. However, they couldn't run from this. In 1978, Nestlé executives were brought before the US Senate for questioning about the impact of Nestlé's formula milk on all of these sick or dying infants. And soon after, new regulations were introduced by the World Health Organization that said companies couldn't compare breast milk with formula milk alternatives in their ads. Whilst this helped in well-regulated countries, in much of Southeast Asia and the Pacific, the
Ayun, na ano yung bansa natin, kasama yung Pilipinas, the regulation and laws were not so well enforced. Ibig sabihin, ito yung nung dati kasi yun nga, yung ano natin, yung mga regulation natin dun sa sa ganun nga, hindi pa ganun ka advance. Kaya tayo yung ginagawa nilang parang kaya tayo yung tawag doon sila parang testing, ginagawa tayong testing ground, guinea pigs, yung mga mahihirap na bansa, nasama yung Pilipinas.
Regulations and laws were not so well enforced, meaning Nestlé doubled down on their marketing in many of these underdeveloped countries with less restrictions, and thus their sales continued to increase. Meanwhile, back in places like the US, where sales had stalled, Nestlé tried to change their tarnished image and promote breast milk by using some very bizarre ads featuring something called the Super Babies.
This is a breastfeeding song for those who help our awesome moms.
The idea was to try and distance themselves from the negative media attention they'd received by making out like they'd totally changed, despite the fact they were still
nag-change sila dun sa mga yung mga first world country sa Amerika, kasi nahinto yung nila dun yung production Pero sa mga underdeveloped country katulad nga ng Pilipinas, sa Asia, still meron silang doon, may kumikita sila doon, nagbebenta sila.
Using the same exploitative tactics to push their formula in countries where they could still get away with it. Even as recently as 2018, a report by Save the Children found the health of millions of vulnerable children were being put at risk because of the aggressive marketing tactics used by Nestlé and several other giant corporations. And yet, despite all of the extremely serious problems their tactics have caused, I'm sorry to say that when it comes to Nestlé's dark past, we're only just getting started.
In Video Business is now 40% off.
Tas na naman. Skip
No
ad.
watermark, high quality exports.
Chapter 3, The Water Crisis.
In 2005, the Nestlé CEO implied that having access to water wasn't a basic human right.
Das Wasser zu
Wala daw. Hindi daw human rights yung access ng water. Kaya tawag doon, siya ng public outcry, kasi syempre yung tubig, basic human rights yan. Hindi ka mabubuhay ng walang tubig. Tapos sasabihin niya, hindi daw basic human rights yun. Talaga tong puting ano pangalan nito?
einem öffentlichen Recht erklärt wird. Das heißt, als Mensch sollten Sie einfach Recht haben, Wasser zu haben. Das ist die eine Extremlösung. Ja?
After the media criticized him for this, he later backtracked. But to see how he really feels, we can simply look at Nestlé's actions when it comes to water. For example, in Pakistan in 2013, Nestlé began diverting clean drinking water away from villages and towns, and then
sa Pakistan, inano nila yung tubig sa mga villages and towns, tapos i-divert nila dun sa sa tawag dun sa company nila, sa production nila.
began bottling it in their factories and selling it back to the same people they took the water from.
Ayun, di ba? Yung sa mga yung source ng water, tatanggalin nila sa village and towns kasi sa Pakistan may hirap eh. Kaya nga yung mga malaking company nila keep them ignorant and poor. Yun ang nila sa mga sa mga ayaw nila mag-develop yung mga ibang bansa talaga. Kasi nga yun pinagkakakitaan nila yan eh. Pag na-develop yun, natuto, ayun, magque-question sila. Kaya ayaw nila nun.
But at a much higher price. The big issue is that Nestle had taken so much water that thousands were forced to drink dirty sludge water instead because these people couldn't afford to buy the expensive bottled water, which, remember, was theirs to begin with. Nestle's strategy was essentially to deprive people of a necessity like clean water and then supply them an expensive alternative. Since Nestle arrived in the country, there are claims they have sucked the land dry and caused water levels to sink hundreds of feet. And it's not just in developing countries where Nestle does this. For example, in America, when California was suffering from droughts, many companies moved their operations out of the state, but not Nestle. In the midst of this very serious water shortage, Nestle Waters continued to pump 705 million gallons of fresh water from California's national parks, draining some of the state's remaining water resources to sell back to Californians. And when asked about this, the Nestle Waters CEO said that if he could bottle more of California's water for profit during the drought, he would. Likewise in Michigan, it was reported Nestle pumps 747 liters of fresh water every minute out of the state's reserves, and that Nestle pays only $200 to take 130 million.
Ayun, sa Flint, Michigan. Ito na rin to naging yung Blackwater. Napanood ko yun yung Blackwater. Si Mark Ruffalo yung yung bida. Ayun, bali attorney siya Gusto niyang inimbestigahan niya yung yung tawag doon. Yung nagkakasakit kasi yung mga ng Flint, Michigan, yung mga tao doon. Then ayun nagrereklamo, inaano nga nila na wala silang tubig. Tsaka kinuha nung yung malaking company. Yun nga Nestle ata yun eh. Pero hindi ko sigurado. Pero yun, maganda yun yung Blackwater. Si Mark Ruffalo.
Gallons of Michigan's water. After Nestle caused a drastic reduction in the state's water levels, a judge eventually ordered Nestle to stop its operations due to the ecological harm they were causing. Whilst it's perhaps not widely known, the reality is Nestle has the largest bottled water operation in the world and owns over 50 brands of bottled water. So Nestle are actually incentivized to target places with limited clean water available from their own natural resources, because if they buy up lots of the natural water supplies and create a shortage, it creates massive demand. If you've seen Mad Max Fury Road, you may remember the guy who was hoarding all the water, and that's not too dissimilar from Nestle's approach. But perhaps where Nestle got a lot of their inspiration was the classic British show Only Fools and Horses. In one episode, the characters decide to sell bottled water by claiming it came from a natural spring, when really it just came straight out of the tap. Now, this show was a comedy, but Nestle decided to basically do that in real life. Nestle has simply bottled up water that comes from the exact same municipal supplies as tap water and advertised it as coming from Clear Mountain Springs, thus allowing them to add a huge markup to the price, when in fact they can buy a tank of this water for $10, use it to fill thousands of plastic.
Ayun, ganun ang ginagawa nila. Inaano nila na galing sa yung sa spring water. Ganyan din sa Pilipinas din ganyan. Yung mga bottled water, sabi nila galing spring water, pero filtered lang yan. Pinilter lang nila. Sabi nila, yung tawag doon, spring water, pero sa lang yan. Kaya ang laki ng kita nila, tingnan mo, $10 ang puhunan.
Bottles and resell this glorified tap water for an estimated $50,000.
Ayun, 10. Tas, yung kikita sila ng $50,000. Ayun, di ba, napaka-greed. Para lang. Tapos tayo nila pinapahirapan. Parang sa Pilipinas, naalala nyo yung family, yung rin yun eh. Nahinto yun, yung family, yung kulay green. Kung naalala nyo yun, nahinto rin yun. Mabuti si Duterte yung presidente na nagpahinto doon. Kasi dapat yung supplier Hindi ko lang maalala kung ano eh, dalawa yung ano dito ng tubig eh. Na 'di ba dapat sa gripo sila yung ano natin hindi hindi malinis yung tap water natin. Hindi iniinumin. Ang nangyayari, yun nga, magbebenta sila ng bottled water. Ano talaga nila yon, yung tawag doon, intended yon, intended na hindi may inom yung tap water natin para makapagbenta sila ng ng bottled water. Ganun. Siyempre mga negosyante, greed nga eh. Sabi sa mga negosyante kasi sa mga greed, money runs the world for them. Yung pera, lahat lang ano nila, puro pera ang lagi naiisip. Lahat ng galaw kailangan pera.
Before we get to the next chapter, can we all just agree that traditional education is broken?
Ipapass forward ko na.
Where the cocoa beans are harvested, and for a while.
Maganda rin to kung saan.
But the brutal truth is that Nestlé has been found to use.
Ayun ito.
Wow.
Hey.
But the brutal truth is that Nestlé has been found to use forced labor and even child slavery on the farms.
Sa mga chocolate, mga kakao Sa Pilipinas din kaya lang hindi natin alam. Ayan, sa ibang bansa, sa Africa, 'di ba? Third world country. Sila child labor sila sa third world country. Doon sila nag-produce, kukunin nila yung mga product. Then, ayun, sell nila sa Kaya yung Africa nga ayaw nilang yan eh. They keep ignorant. Gusto nila ignorante. Kaya nga inalis nila si Gaddafi. Si Gaddafi talaga maganda eh. Siya nagpaunlad ng Libya. Tapos ng Amerika. Siyempre nga negosyo.
Where the cocoa beans are harvested. And for a while, this cheap exploitative labor went mostly unnoticed, leading to low costs and high profits. But then in the year 2000, a report came out that said Nestlé was guilty of buying blood chocolates, and that Nestlé was fully aware.
Ayun, blood chocolates, parang blood diamonds, yung movie ni yung blood chocolates kasi, ang ibig sabihin niyan, blood chocolates, yung yung labor, yung mga child labor, yung mga slaves, yung kaya tinawag na blood chocolate regarding sa yung sa labor, yung child labor, child exploitations, yung tawag din slavery, yan. Sabihin yung mga tatrabaho dyan sa Nestlé, sa mga nila, sa pag ng mga chocolate, yung kakao is slavery, parang slavery. Binabayaran nila, siyempre, magkano lang bayad siguro. Hindi ko alam pero mababa compare sa dun sa gawa nilang trabaho. Parang sa blood diamond, kung napanood niyo yung blood diamond, sa'yo naman yung yung literal na diamond. Tapos ang mga kumukuha ng diamonds yung mga slaves. Nag-i-slave sila ng mga sa South Africa rin yun eh. Then ayun nga, nila, exploit, then
the enslaved children were working on their plantations. Now, this was also true for many of the big chocolate companies. So in their homes and families are being forced to work on plantations for very little or no money at all.
Ayun sa Africa. Kaya kawawa talaga yung bansang Africa. Napakayaman niya, kaya lang ngayon tawag dito, maraming resources.
Then an investigation in 2020 discovered that children as young as 8 were picking coffee on the farms of one of Nestlé's suppliers.
Ayun, 8 years old. Child exploitation talaga.
It was reported children worked 7 days a week, carrying sacks that weighed twice their weight, and got paid around $1 an hour for their work. However, once again, Nestlé denied knowledge of this and said they tried to fix it. And to be fair here, this is a complex issue that's certainly not limited just to Nestlé. But what does...
Ayun, ito na. Ayun. Hindi na lang naman Nestlé gumagawa niyan. Ito na.
Knowledge of this and said they tried to fix
Nestlé.
it. And to be fair here, this is a complex issue that's certainly not limited just to Nestlé.
Nestlé, Philip Morris, tsaka Apple. Lahat ng big company, gano'n naman. Nag-ano sila ng ano. Doon sila pupunta sa mga ano, yung mga underdeveloped country. Doon nila i-exploit yung tao, yung nature, yung minerals. Tapos, ayun, ganun. Tapos, ito. Ano na pala, okay na yan siguro. Ano na, haba ang tagal na natin. Tagal na. Ay, sana may natutunan kayo. Kung gusto niyo, tapusin niyo tong ano. Maganda to, yung ano, Magnets Media. Marami kang matututunan. Okay, sige. Bye-bye. Sana may natutunan kayo. Sigurado naman meron kasi ano, informative yung ano, informative yung topic. Kaya maganda, di ba? Okay. Nandun lang. Salamat sa kung nanood kayo. Tsaka ano, subscribe nyo yung channel ko Tsaka yung follow nyo yung Facebook page ko. Tsaka like and subscribe. Okay, bye-bye.